All right, welcome back. We are here with SCI TV Sports Conflict Matters. I'm Joshua Gordon, and I am thrilled to welcome Ryan Leipz to the show. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to be here.
Ryan, you are with Global Sports Advocates, a group that I have long admired, and my dear friend Paul started and leads. How are things going over there for you guys?
They've been very busy. We've been picking up a lot of work in the anti-doping space this fall, um, a lot of work in the safeguarding space. So it has kept us on our toes for the past several months.
Yeah, those are two areas that they're unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, depending on your perspective, but unfortunately, there's no shortage of work there. But I think part of our goal in these kind of conversations is to help people better understand those kinds of spaces. Maybe as a way to get there in our conversation, you could share a bit more about your background, which is pretty unique, and some of the things you've worked on to prepare you for these types of topics.
Sure. So I got into sports law almost by accident, I think. I started as a prosecutor at the Manhattan DA and was doing criminal law for most of my career. I moved to Denver with my spouse in 2019, and I needed a job. And the U.S. Center for Safe Sport was new and was hiring. So I joined them, mostly because of my background in special victims and sex crimes. Uh, didn't know a lot about them at the time, but joining them when they were less than 2 years old, I quickly learned probably more than almost anybody else about this organization and the work they were doing. And I was there for a little over 2 years, helping them grow, helping them pass the second legislation, which was the Empowering Olympic, Paralympic, and Amateur Athletes Act of 2020, and helping stabilize the organization as both their internal legal counsel for a while and then as outside legal and litigation counsel for them. I took some time off, went back to the Department of Justice doing criminal prosecutions for a while. And then there was an opportunity this spring, as you mentioned, to join Global Sports Advocates and join Paul Green. And I had, of course, crossed paths with Paul uh, back when I was at SafeSport, and it just seemed like a fantastic opportunity to not only continue some of the work that I had done with safeguarding, but also to do more litigation in the international sports law space, because obviously Paul's one of the top international sports lawyers there is. So it's been a fantastic ride so far, and it's been a real pleasure to work with and learn from Paul.
Am I right to assume you hadn't specialized in Swiss law before, but maybe now have boned up a bit on it?
I had not specialized in Swiss law, although during my interview with Paul, when he said, "Are you okay going to Switzerland for hearings?" That, of course, was not a roadblock at all for me. So that was a welcome bonus.
And you came after they improved the facility for the Court of Arbitration of Sport as well. It's a beautiful place now.
Yes.
So, for those who don't know some of the history around the safe sport movement, can you give us a little bit of that historical background about what even were the leading factors in some of the major cases? Obviously, famously, Nasser and some of these things that have popped up, and then what laid that legislative foundation for where we're seeing all the governance and application across sport more broadly.
Absolutely. So safe sport or safeguarding as an idea had actually, been percolating within the U.S. Olympic community for a while. And starting in the 2010s, the U.S. Olympic Committee had actually started taking some steps in this direction. But I think like a lot of ideas like that, getting the resources and money and action behind it happens when there's big events. And no doubt, I think the Larry Nasser scandal was the big event. There obviously were a few other major scandals, Sandusky and others, that really brought a light to this is actually happening. It's happening at a much bigger scale than people had recognized. And there needed to be some amount of action that was done on it. So often you'll hear that Congress created SafeSport, but that's not true. It actually was an internal U.S. Olympic Committee and I say U.S. Olympic Committee because that's what they called themselves at the time. It was an internal U.S. Olympic Committee unit that then got spun off around the shortly after Nasser happened, and in early 2017, it opened its doors as an independent, standalone entity that was tasked with investigating, safeguarding issues within U.S. Olympic and Paralympic sports. Um, at the time, all of its power was contractual. So it was basically, if you agree to be a member of a national governing body, or you agree to be a member of a Paralympic sport that's overseen by the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee, then you were agreeing to be bound by this code of conduct, which has come to be called the SafeSport Code. But eventually there were some issues with that, jurisdictionally and otherwise, because sports are very different in how they handle membership, how they handle control at the grassroots level. So in 2017, there was momentum to pass the first Safe Sport law, which was eventually passed and signed into law, and gave the Center for Safe Sport here in the United States some, I think, legitimacy and teeth, as far as it was backed not only by these contractual arrangements, but by the force of federal law. And that really was what empowered them to really move forward within this space, to grow, to do things beyond sort of their starting mission, which was simply focused on response and resolution of cases, but to do more on the education front, to do more on institutional compliance issues. And so, from that basis, they've taken off in what is now the current U.S. Center for Safe Sport.
Can you help our audience understand a bit about how narrow or broad some of the topics that fall under that jurisdiction are? Because I do think there's a bit of a misunderstanding out there for a lot of folks that it's a fairly, from their perspective, a fairly narrow set of problems that the center focuses on, whereas it may be a bit broader than folks anticipate.
It almost certainly is broader than many folks anticipate. Their starting point and what they call their exclusive jurisdiction stems from things that I think you can categorize as sexual misconduct. And that includes both sexual misconduct involving children and then sexual misconduct among adults. However, they also have a role in dealing with issues around physical and emotional abuse, dealing with failure to report, which was obviously something that was a big part of many scandals, including Larry Nasser. And then they have a role to play in retaliation and related types of allegations where people are interfering with the ability of organizations like Safe Sport or national governing bodies to actually investigate and address these issues. So they have a wider mandate than many people recognize, although within their own rules, they don't necessarily personally handle all of the physical and emotional abuse, the bullying that gets reported to them.
And how much of the efforts have shifted to also bolstering some of that prevention side, whether it's background screens or other methods to kind of create the Swiss cheese layers of protection, where ideally you stack enough of them and those holes get filled?
That's definitely been a growing part of what they're doing. I think there's a recognition that it's never going to be enough to just respond after the fact and issue sanctions.
So we got these collapsing there for a second.
So that's been a growing part of what they're working on. They do it in a couple of ways. They support background checks, but that actually is something that the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee oversees among NGBs, the requirements there. But they also help develop policies around what adults and minor athletes are allowed to do. And they're really prevention policies, not misconduct policies. I'll also give you an example. They've created rules around when you can text minors if you're a coach. And that's, I think, it's something I certainly see from my end as a lawyer in private practice now. It was something we saw a lot at Safe Sport. And I think it's something in the broader community you hear being discussed, which is everyone's texting. But when should an adult coach be texting a minor athlete? What are the ground rules for that? What's acceptable and what's not? And prior to these rules, there was a patchwork of what different teams or clubs considered acceptable. And so they've really moved to a system where you're not really supposed to be texting one-on-one with minor athletes, but it's entirely fine to text the whole team. It's entirely fine to text the parents and the minor athletes. And so they've set some prevention rules like that to help avoid some of the issues they were seeing. On top of that, they have been increasing their training. And I think over time, their training has gotten much better. Their training offerings have become more specific to issues that they saw. And so on all of those fronts, they've been working to help kind of what you call like the Swiss cheese, to kind of patch all of these different holes in ways that just investigating and sanctioning the people that get caught are going to leave those problems available to all these teams, and they're trying to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, I've been appreciative of the added education. I actually don't let a single MBA student graduate out of the University of Oregon without getting SafeSport certified as part of one of the classes they take with me. So we do try and get folks who don't traditionally fall under the jurisdiction still to get exposed to it when they can.
Absolutely.
Now, where are some of the blind spots that are out there? Because obviously you mentioned, some of the NGBs and others, but where are entities that exist where maybe inadvertently they're functioning as safe havens or safe harbor for potential bad actors around safety?
The real challenge that, I certainly saw when I was at SafeSport, but it seems to still be the biggest challenge is we were talking about the breadth of SafeSport as its policies, but another way you can look at it is the breadth of what they cover from elite to grassroots. And you're talking about your students taking this training. There's a lot of people who are covered by SafeSport's policies that frankly probably don't know the first thing about what those policies actually say. They probably don't even know that they're covered by the policies. And that's because the elite athletes, the athletes in the development pipeline, the coaches, the trainers that are in those parts of the Olympic and Paralympic movement, they know the rules. They're used to there being rules in sport with the WADA code and other things. But at the grassroots level, it's sometimes an accident that a small swimming team is affiliated with USA Swimming. And all people know is that they have to pay some amount of money to be a USA Swimming member in order for their kid to be on this team. And maybe as the parent, they go volunteer to be the coach. And it's not always apparent to people. And I think there's still gaps here in making people realize they're covered by these rules. These rules apply to them, and they are responsible for actually knowing what they can and can't do. And certainly, something we see all the time is going back to the texting, people just going, I actually had no idea that was the rule. Everyone else at my organization does it, and I thought I could too. And so I think there still is a huge gap in understanding, especially at these local and grassroots levels, uh, who's even covered and what the rules are.
And so now that you're outside of that direct ecosystem, what are some of the ways that you are trying to help others or support others, whether it's either navigating from a due process standpoint or potentially getting out in front of this with their policies, procedures, governance? What are some of the ways that you're finding to intervene from this new seat that you sit in?
That's an interesting question. And now I sometimes am representing clients, and we represent both. We've represented people who are victims. We've represented people who've been accused by SafeSport. And so sometimes I'm a thorn in their side, I think. But what I've told them is, I've also saved you from a lot of problems because people will reach out to us and they're trying to figure out SafeSport. And often we can help them navigate it in a way that no one else has. And so from the outside, that's definitely something that there's still a lot of confusion when people are involved in this process. A lot of the people that reach out to us want to make a SafeSport report, and they don't actually know if they can, what it means to make a report, whether SafeSport is going to take their case. And sometimes the answer is that's actually not something SafeSport does. And sometimes the answer is, yes, you definitely need to report this. And here, we can help you do it. And so there's still a lot out there about a lot of confusion out there about how to make these reports, how to get people to the resources that they need. And so that's been an interesting part for me in private practice is that much of my work has involved just helping people understand the system. And it's a skill and a knowledge base that I have that just is not that prevalent. And I'm able to help people navigate these processes in a way that otherwise you would have individuals that were just totally lost.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. As far as governance goes, it's relatively in its infancy. So it's a big learning curve for a lot of stakeholders across that whole platform, right?
Absolutely. And, I talk about victims and respondents, but we've had local swim clubs as clients. We've had NGBs reach out to us and say, we need help understanding how to navigate these processes. We need help understanding what this means. And so there's I think, a big need out there for more guidance on what these rules mean, how these rules can be implemented, because in many ways, there are a lot of challenges for these organizations in figuring out how to take rules written by SafeSport from their office in Denver and apply it in real life events, in real sporting situations where what was written doesn't always make sense for the field of play. And that's a big challenge because you're talking about a ton of different sports. You're talking about a ton of different environments where these rules have to get implemented. And it's a huge challenge for the sporting bodies. And so that's something that, we've worked with them as well to help them understand, how do we actually do this? How do we navigate this situation?
Yeah, and I imagine too, and here I'm going to ask you a question where we're going to put all the caveats. We're not providing legal advice. We're not forming an attorney-client relationship with anyone who's listening or any of those things. But if you were to give advice to folks like the AAUs of the world who aren't currently under the jurisdiction, what advice would you give them when they think about safeguarding more broadly? Should they become signatories? Should they parallel these processes with some best practices? What do you think they should be doing to be a good contributor in these spaces?
That's certainly something you hear all the time, right? Which is that the sport bodies that are under safe sports jurisdiction are concerned that they're going to lose out to the sport bodies that are not because of the regulations. And, that's, I think, a real concern. I think it's a legitimate concern. Ultimately, though, I don't think the past, what are we at, 8 years now, has shown that that's going to be as significant of a concern as many people thought it would be. And I think that's a lesson for other sport organizations who have not put as much money or time or resources into safeguarding. You're going to have to eventually. That's the reality of it. Eventually, something's going to happen, and you're going to be forced into the situation of addressing it. I am not a believer that this is just an issue with one sport, that this is just an issue with uh, one sport that's in the Olympic community or two sports that are in the Olympic community. It is an issue everywhere. It's a question of, are people actually looking to address it? Is there actually a way for people to report it? And those are all things that I think over time, everyone's going to have these mechanisms in place. They may look different, and that's fine. There may be improvements to the system over time, and hopefully there is. But at the end of the day, if you're not putting any money, any resources into safeguarding, if you're not taking it seriously, I think you're ultimately going to be left behind because eventually parents are not going to want to go to the organizations that have chosen to disregard safe sport. They're not going to want to go to the organizations that don't take that seriously.
Yeah, as a father of a 7-year-old, I would question an organization that didn't put that at least somewhere at the very high beginning forefront of the relationship with my child.
Absolutely. And, to be honest, I think for organizations under the Olympic and Paralympic movement, safe sport has the benefit of they can concentrate more on sport because they actually don't have to focus on these issues as much because there's an independent body to do it. And so that's huge, especially for small sports. You take small NGBs, these investigations can become really expensive really fast. So by having a system like SafeSport where there's jurisdiction that can handle these investigations, that have the resources and knowledge, which are really hard to come by when you're at an NGB, and there's some of them that have a couple of staff members total, it becomes very difficult to then be responsible for doing a sexual misconduct investigation. It's very hard to do right when you don't know what you're doing. So I actually think at the end of the day, there's that added benefit from an organizational perspective of actually being able to have a separate organization that can handle this kind of work within the movement.
And your colleague Paul has rightly raised a bit of a challenging issue, which is that intersection of those folks who fall under the SafeSport umbrella, but then they have these dual roles with things like the NCAA and member institutions. So they may be a basketball coach, both for as part of USA Basketball, but then they may have, a Division II college that they're an assistant coach at, and they're not under that jurisdiction. What would be some of the issues you'd want to flag for those universities who currently are not under that umbrella, but may want to be careful about having someone who could potentially be a banned, individual under one umbrella, and then have these contractual relationships to either keep them or a different process to investigate under the university umbrella?
Again, not giving legal advice, but certainly I think there could be a lot of problems that would come from hiring someone that you knew or should have known was banned. Because if somebody's suspended, SafeSport publicly posts their names. If you choose to hire them for a coaching position or other position of authority, and something later happens. So I think that those organizations just on that front would need to be very careful. And I think that part of the issue has been historically, people did not even know that there was a comprehensive banned list for the Olympic and Paralympic movement. So even though it was online, people didn't know to check that. And I know there's been changes over time where more and more organizations, even if they're outside the Olympic and Paralympic movement, they're taking advantage of those public resources from SafeSport to double check that the people that they're putting in positions of authority, that they're hiring as coaches, are not going to be the same people that appear on SafeSport's ban list.
What do you think about some of the things I've heard contemplated? Put some language as part of the hiring process for any of the stakeholders in the collegiate movement to have put an affirmative duty on them to disclose if they know they are part of a current investigation, because maybe they're not already on a banned list, but to disclose if they're on there, or even putting some contractual hooks in there that if they were to end up on a ban list, that would be reason for just cause for termination from that other role there. Thoughts on some of those types of remedies that people are contemplating where they don't have the governance umbrella, but maybe want to lean towards contractual remedies like that?
It's certainly something that I think I would be likely to advise a client to consider. And it's not in any way without precedent. These types of provisions have long existed. They weren't SafeSport specific. But these types of provisions have long existed for people that you're going to pay, in some instances at the college level, millions of dollars to. And I think those types of disclosure requirements can avoid problems down the road because, I think we've seen even recent examples, including with USA Swimming, of having to uh, pull various offers and things like that after the fact when things come to light. And you want to be in a position where that doesn't happen because it's frankly bad for both sides when it comes to light publicly in a way that you're not anticipating. So I actually think that's a great idea for organizations to consider.
Great. And when you think about safeguarding broadly and you had a magic wand, are there a few things that you've been contemplating that you really wish we would do? I mean, there may be reasons why it's hard to do, but if you had that magic wand, what would you be hoping we would be doing out there in the landscape?
In the United States, I think the Center for Safe Sport has to move cases faster. Right now, it doesn't work for anybody. And, we hear from both sides, claimants and respondents, and frankly, club administrators. And it's a problem for everybody that cases languish for really extended periods of time, going into years. It's understandable that once in a while a case is going to be particularly complex. The reality of what we see, though, is that many, many, many cases seem relatively simple to us. There's a couple of witnesses, there's potentially a couple of pieces of evidence, and yet cases languish for years. Claimants and respondents both hear very little throughout the process. Some of that's by design and understandable. As a prosecutor, I understand there's times where you're not going to go share everything you know with relevant witnesses and parties. At the same time, I think the system has to move faster if it's going to work because at this point, they have an overwhelming number of cases. I think they've made attempts, and in some instances, I've personally seen things moving faster and more expeditiously. At the same time, we still see cases languishing for long periods of time, and I think that has to change.
That's great advice. And let me shift you a bit here, still in some ways related to safeguarding, but let's talk about some of the work you do around anti-doping. And the reason why I give it a safeguarding hook is one of the primary arguments to create not just a level playing field in sport, but is to help protect folks from feeling pressured to do things that may not be in their own personal health interests in order to be on a level playing field. So I do think often we could conceive of anti-doping and some of the movement around there to be under safeguarding as well. But let's talk about some of the work you're doing there and some of the things that are jumping out at you.
So some of the things that are jumping out on us. Well, first I'll say we just had a big win with uh, a, a non-professional athlete who is with USA Powerlifting, and she was banned without any due process, and we appealed to CAS, and we fortunately got a very good settlement with USA Powerlifting. She's back in sport. She's back able to compete. And so that was a huge win that we were actually able to accomplish for her in 6 weeks. So on that front, we've been very happy on a sport we don't see come up a lot for us, but it was a great win for our client against USA Powerlifting. In general, recently, we've been seeing a lot of cases, uh, even with IRMS, which is attempting to identify uh, exogenous testosterone. And we had a huge win there a few weeks ago with Jaime Munguia, the Mexican boxer. And we were able to show scientifically that it was actually 4 contaminated supplements he was taking, 4, each with pregnenolone, resulting in him showing what appeared to be exogenous testosterone metabolites was really the result of the contaminated pregnenolone, which is not banned. So we had a great win on that case before World Boxing, who exonerated Jaime. He's back competing. And so that was an amazing win there. And overall, we've just had a variety of whereabouts cases, more and more of those cases as athletes are being tested more and more. We're seeing athletes that just over the course of 12 months have missed 3 tests. And those are really hard cases because those cases are athletes that frankly aren't doping. Sometimes it's just an athlete that's a little scatterbrained. And it's really, really sad to see the pretty draconian penalties that come from having 3 whereabouts violations for athletes that are being tested multiple times a month in some instances. So that's been keeping us busy working to protect those athletes and try to get them good resolutions as good as we can under the current WADA code for missed whereabouts.
Yeah, it's great to hear that perspective because I would say a lot of the popular conversation is immediately jumping to a very binary categorization of someone's either a doper or not a doper. And as soon as someone gets flagged or brought into the processes under WADA, that they feel like, well, they must be guilty. And obviously there is some burden shift built by design into the governance model. But it sounds like some of the things that you're seeing trending out of global sports advocates is that in fact there are a lot of folks who are not in fact cheating but are getting caught up by sensitivity of tests and some procedural challenges as well.
Absolutely. And I have to say, as a person who wasn't always in the anti-doping space, this had been a learning experience for me too, because the media always reports it as you're a doper or you're not a doper. And those press releases often are going out very, very early in the case before our side has even had a chance to do an investigation. Because our investigation, and you mentioned the burden, for the most part, we often have the burden, unlike in a criminal situation, to actually prove what happened and to prove that it was contamination or to prove that this was a lab error or to prove that it was some source that the athlete should not be at fault for. And that can be a really tough burden, especially because the tests come, the results come maybe 3 months later. And then you're trying to work backwards and say, what did you eat? What supplements were you taking back then? Going over every minute of someone's day to figure out what could have caused these tests. That can be a really tough burden to meet. We've had a lot of success doing it. You flagged the sensitivity of the tests, and that's something that we are seeing more and more on positive tests, detecting incredibly low amounts. that can be helpful for us in establishing that it's contamination, but it's still our burden. And so as these tests get more and more sensitive, as athletes are tested more and more often, as they're making more and more use of athlete biological passports in the way that WADA's using them, and Paul had I think the first and the only win still for an athlete with who had been accused of a violation for an athlete biological passport. It can be really tough. These are tough cases that are based on complicated science, and they take a while. So those early press releases that say someone's a doper, they're pretty unfair because you haven't even had a chance to dig in and say what's going on here.
Yeah, and I guess you thought you were leaving the prosecutorial world by going to some defense work, but probably you're doing the same prosecutorial work just from the different perspective.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Any other thoughts that you want to share about, broadly speaking, around safeguarding, whether it's the anti-doping work, some of the stuff we were talking about around safe sport, as you are trying to give people good advice, because the best advice means they don't need your help, right? We've prevented some of these problems and people are just focusing in on their role in sport, which is what we really like to celebrate, but we know how important this work is to make sure that everyone's got their due process and a level playing field in what they're working on.
You're exactly right that every client, no matter how good of a result we get them, tells me, I hope I never speak to you again. So nobody ever wants to speak with us, but one of the things that I'll end on is, one of the benefits of having our experience and our knowledge is that we know this space. I know the safe sport space. Paul knows the anti-doping space like nobody else. And we've tried to bring that knowledge to our clients and to our work in a way where we have both good relationships with the regulatory organizations, but we also know how to prevail in these cases, what defenses are going to work, what defenses are going to make sense, and how to investigate them. My hope, my final note is that safe sport can improve. I think it's important to have this system, as I've already talked about, but I do think it has to move faster. I think it has to be done better if it's going to ultimately continue and be successful and not drown in cases lingering for months and years. And so my last note is that I hope that safe sport can make those changes so that cases can move along. They get the resources that are necessary to do the job they've been assigned, and that we can have fairness for everybody in the process.
Ryan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I know that the entire system benefits from this type of expert and zealous advocacy, and that the entire system benefits and is better off for that type of thoughtfulness. So thank you so much today for spending some time talking about it and shedding some light.
Thanks so much, Josh.